Historical Background Lecture, A Brief History of Human Progress. Why are some countries poor? Actually, we probably should start with a different question. Why aren't all countries poor? All historical and anthropological indicators tell us that poverty is the norm of human existence. Since its beginnings, human life has been essentially an ongoing search for food. And chronic hunger, malnutrition, disease, and early death bear testimony to the difficulty of that quest. Now, times of plenty did occur now and then, but they were both unpredictable and, more importantly, unsustainable. Humans were trapped in a kind of catch-22 situation. Periods in which food was plentiful resulted in population increase, which strained the food supply, which in turn caused population to decline. It's true that there were in some times and places small groups within large populations that lived in relative wealth, rising above subsistence. It's also true that there were periods of flowering. Ancient Greece, the Roman era, the Chinese Sung dynasty come readily to mind, but these golden eras are as notable for their decline as they are for their advances. Throughout human history, periods of economic well-being have generally been the exception rather than the norm. Indeed, in the full sweep of history, these episodes are so few and fleeting as to be virtually unnoticeable. The ability to sustain economic well-being for large populations is new, arguably no more than 250 years old, a blink in the span of history. Speaking at the 1993 Nobel ceremony, economic historian Douglas North paired human history with a 24-hour clock as a stark illustration of the incredibly small amount of time in which production has been great enough to sustain continued population growth and to provide even modest comforts to significant portions of a population. Before 1750, the slow pace of vital discoveries and technologies was largely the result of what is known as a food-energy trap, in which insufficient food and inadequate nutrition produced a chronically malnourished population without the energy to increase production. Remember, however, that this is not a case of people choosing poorly. It's scarcity, in which people have few alternatives from which to choose. As North's population clock clearly indicated, 1750 begins a new chapter in the record of human well-being. Even as we marvel at the explosion of population and technology that has characterized the last 2 centuries, we have to be struck by the significant number of nations in today's world where subsistence activities still occupy much of the population. Hunger, disease, and early death are still the fate of millions. Even today, wealth, not poverty, is the anomaly, shifting our inquiry from why poverty to why not poverty? If poverty is the norm, why not in every country? What difference or differences have allowed some to escape wretchedness? Exploring those differences will be the focus of the lessons in Is Capitalism Good for the Poor? But before we go there, let's fill out the historical picture, paying attention to what we know about the human condition before 1750 and to where the sustained changes in well-being took place. As we've noted, significant change in the human condition began in the mid-18th century. Leading the breakaway from hunger, malnutrition, chronic disease, and early death were the nations of Western Europe. The mechanization and commercialization of agriculture, known as the Second Agricultural Revolution, was quickly followed by an industrial revolution in England, France, the rest of Western Europe, and eventually the United States. The resulting increase in productivity initiated and sustained a population explosion by raising birth rates and reducing mortality rates. Social indicators like infant mortality, life expectancy, and even height verified that it was Western Europe that first discovered the path out of poverty. Until the mid-18th century, life expectancy for the world was somewhere in the 20s. As the table shows, by the end of the 18th century, life expectancy in the United Kingdom and France had risen to 30, an increase all the more notable when compared to China and India over a century later. Low life expectancy at birth is a reflection of high infant mortality rates. The historical norm was upwards of 25% of babies died before their first birthdays. In France and England, infant mortality fell below 20% by the early 1800s. China and India lagged well behind, not falling below the 20% level until the mid-20th century. Even today, when infant mortality in Europe and North America are below 1%, the rates in China, India, and Africa remain at 4, 6, and 9% respectively. An interesting measure of well-being that has become useful to historians is height. It's a relatively good indicator of standard of living, because if people's bodies don't take in enough calories, they don't reach their genetic potential in terms of height. While the height of any individual person doesn't tell us anything, the average height of a population reflects nutritional intake, an excellent indicator of standard of living. Because height is frequently recorded by armies, it's a useful data set for historians studying economic growth. In England, the most economically developed nation in the mid-1700s, the average height of adult males was 5 feet 5 inches. We can see the effects of improved food supplies by looking at a similar population, that of the United States, where the average height of adult males today is 5 feet 10 inches. Another measure showing Western nations leading the escape from poverty is real income per person, or GDP per capita. While we caution that the evidence here is inexact, derived as it must be from estimates, it reinforces other evidence that the rise out of poverty began in Europe long before the rest of the world. In about the year 1000, China was the most economically advanced empire, its real income slightly ahead of Europe. 1,000 years later, Europe's in the clear lead, as India, China, and Africa struggle to maintain even their modest gains, and sometimes aren't successful in even that endeavor. While the rest of the world changed little, Europe and the American colonies advanced. By the mid-20th century, citizens of North American and European nations enjoyed incomes many multiples above people in the rest of the world. The impact of the regional differences is even more apparent when we realize that poor nations of today, see the countries in the lower part of the chart, have levels of real per capita income that were surpassed in Europe as much as 1,000 years ago, or that they have not yet attained the standard of living experienced by Western peoples at the time of the American Revolution. The social indicator and income data confirm what Douglas North's clock analogy suggests. The road out of poverty is new, and it's been traveled by only a few countries: Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, South Korea, and that's about it. Interestingly also is the data showing that things are changing in China and India. 50 years ago, they had lower per capita incomes than most of the poor African nations do today. Again, we ask, what's different? Is there a roadmap leading to a life of plenty, or a set of policies and institutions that developing countries can adopt in order to replicate the success of advanced modern economies? A forthright answer to this question is equivocal. While we can't map out a clear highway to wealth, research by development organizations and university scholars provides us with road signs, helps us to avoid wrong turns and dead ends, and generally points us in the right directions. Obviously, a nation's wealth, or its total output, is a function of its inputs, the inputs it can contribute to the productive process, natural resources, the size and quality of its labor force and pool of entrepreneurial talent, and its stock of capital. However, the available inputs don't tell the whole story. There's also the question of how capably a nation can turn its inputs into outputs. Productivity, the measure of output per capita, is the key to increasing production and to raising standards of living, especially in times of population growth. What happens to per capita output, for example, if a nation's population and labor force increase by 10% and other inputs to production also increase by 10%? Right, nothing. The standard of living will remain unchanged unless productivity, the ability to produce more with the same resources, also changes. This phenomenon is readily illustrated in American history. Into the first quarter of the 20th century, up to 80% of the American labor force farmed for a living. Today, that number is under 3%. And in the intervening century, American population grew. And Americans themselves grew bigger, ate more, and worked fewer hours in greater safety and comfort. This increase in agricultural productivity has occurred at some point in all the advanced economies of the world. It allows the sons and daughters of farming families to move into jobs producing other goods and services. The agricultural and industrial revolutions that began in England in the mid-18th century brought to Western Europe a sustained period of innovation. This is not to suggest that there was no innovation before 1750. Certainly there was. The difference is that it occurred randomly and in spurts, and it tended to produce population growth that swallowed up any income increases that were created. The difference around 1750 was that innovative activity became sustained, and the result was increased productivity. The most important innovations led to improvements in technology, increased specialization and division of labor, economies of scale, improved organization and resource allocation, and improvements in the quality of human capital through education and better health care. Why did these sources of productivity growth develop so successfully in some parts of the world but not in others? The short answer is that some nations developed the necessary institutional framework to support growth, and others did not. Between 1400 and 1700, three key institutional changes in Europe created the environment in which the seeds of rapid productivity growth took root. First, factors like the Black Plague and the change of the technology of war led to the collapse of feudalism. Second, competition among nation-states, spurred in part by the emergence of Protestantism, limited the ability of government to close markets and inhibit trade. And finally, nation-states grew strong enough to control violence. It greatly reduced piracy and brigandage and helped to establish and secure people's rights to property. These changes allowed people to focus on exchange and innovation rather than on having to defend themselves and their property. Institutions, the laws, rules, and customs of the society, lay out the incentives that generate dynamic process in some nations and stifle creativity and enterprise in others. Examining the successful economies of Europe, North America, and Asia helps us to identify a partial list of the institutions that allow economies to flourish. First, the rule of law, coupled with limited government and open political participation. Second, clearly defined and consistently enforced rights to private property. Third, open competitive markets with freedom of entry and exit, widespread access to capital and to information, low transaction costs, and reliable contract enforcement. And fourth, an atmosphere of individual freedom in which education and health are accessible and valued. The good news for the modern era is that the information revolution and the spread of democracy means that institutional change is occurring in places that have previously been cut off from economic growth. More importantly, we know that where economic growth has taken hold, it has benefited all layers of society. Increasing standards of living is not simply a matter of redistributing or more evenly distributing output. It's a matter of producing more. Evidence that production is the way to wealth can be seen in the United States, where income growth has been so great and so widespread during the last century that people labeled officially poor by the U.S. government have incomes greater than average Americans in 1950 and greater than all but the richest 5% in 1990. The per capita income poverty line in the United States, $8,500 annually, may seem low compared to the income of middle-class Americans, but it far surpasses the mean per capita income of most of the rest of the world. The good news on the world front is that some countries have recently undergone institutional changes that foster economic growth, and the results are readily apparent. Not only has the share of world population living on less than $1 a day declined, but for the first time in history, so has the number. Regardless of the fact that some areas of the world are still struggling, and that some are even losing ground, more and more people are living longer and in greater ease, comfort, and dignity. Although war and natural catastrophes still imperil regions, the historical record gives us reason to expect that the trend that began in 1750, the trend to higher standards of living and reduced poverty, will continue. As we proceed through the lessons in Is Capitalism Good for the Poor, we'll examine each of the institutions that foster that trend.